Okay, good afternoon. Welcome back to WOTE. I hope for some of you, or to some of you who are coming for the first time. This is our second day of our first virtual WOTE conference. And we are going to be hearing from Isaac Ewuso, I think I got that right, who will be speaking on from speculative to argumentative writing, leveraging pandemic visual literacy and multimodal communication in a writing course. So that sounds really interesting. I'm going to introduce Isaac here and then let him take it away. I will be, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat or the Q&A, and I will let Isaac know when questions come up, and then we'll try to leave about 5 minutes at the end for additional questions as well. Please feel free to tweet out comments at #WOTE2021 about the conference, if you would. And then let me introduce our next presenter. This is Isaac Ewuso, who is an adjunct instructor of English at Oakton Community College in Des Plaines, Illinois, and William Rainey Harper College in Palatine, Illinois, where he teaches first-year composition courses. Isaac graduated from DePaul University at Chicago with a Master of Arts degree in Writing, Rhetoric, and Discourse, teaching certificates in TESOL, and teaching English at the two-year college. Isaac also holds a Bachelor of Arts degrees in Political Science and Philosophy from the University of Illinois at Chicago. His interests include digital rhetoric, first-year writing, social media, and Gen Z critical thinking and rhetoric. So, without further ado, here is Isaac.
Thank you, Sue. Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to start. This presentation is titled From Speculative to Argumentative Writing, Leveraging Pandemic Visual Analysis and Multimodal Communication in a Writing Course. First, I want to look at the agenda. I'm going to start with a preamble to this presentation. There's going to be some activities. You will be able to use the chat function to communicate. We're going to talk about the definition of pandemic visual literacy. I'm going to talk about slogans, and I'm going to talk about speculative writing. I'm also going to talk about multimodality. And I will talk to you about some of the activities I've done in my class to foster visual literacy, specifically pandemic visual literacy. And there's going to be a discussion and question section. I want to clarify this because I just want to make sure that we understand that I am not talking about everything about the pandemic. It's not exclusively focused on the pandemic. I'm sure that many of us, we've heard about it, we know about it. We've been bombarded with news about the pandemic. So the purpose of this presentation is not to continue that trend of negative news about the pandemic. My goal in this presentation is to discuss and explore various ways in which pandemic visual literacy, analysis, and multimodal communication can be heightened in a writing intensive course by way of reflective and speculative writing. And then the goal is to transition to argumentative writing. That's what I teach in first-year courses. And this is inspired by an advanced writing class I taught at Harper and at Oakton College. One was face-to-face, and the other is asynchronous. So when I started thinking about this topic of pandemic visual literacy, I had in mind recent events. We had first the assumption that students getting a lot of visuals, receiving a lot of visual contents from what have you, maybe TV or the internet. And so my plan was to make this relatable, and so the way I went about it was to think about how I can focus on socio-political events relevant to the American context. I also had the assumption that they've also had various perspectives from these visuals. And one way I proposed to deal with this was to give them space to reflect about their writing, reflect about what they're seeing. I also recognized that students are aware that images have some sort of arguments. But I was thinking, okay, how are students going to analyze this? And so I thought about coming up with heuristics for analysis, clear set of instructions to aid them in identifying arguments. Another challenge or assumption that I had prior to the class, that some students probably do not have refined skills to analyze visuals. And I'm going to talk about research that I found out. And this research says that that students, especially specifically college students, don't do a good job when it comes to analyzing visuals. I have something to say about that from my classroom experience. And I'm also sure that from the pandemic visuals, you've seen that you probably have different reactions as to the purpose of, as to the image, what sort of the contents, whether they're graphic. And my plan was to avoid something that's going to be extreme. So the first activity is this. In one word sentence, please attempt to capture some of your thoughts on pandemic visuals in general. Please use the chat box. Let's take about 30 seconds to do that, if possible, or a minute. Okay, got one response, moving, scary, inspirational, frustrating, depressing. Whoa, that's all interesting. Perspectives. Let's see if we have more. Okay, I'm just gonna continue. So that's good. Depressing. I thought about this. Remember, I said at the beginning that this is not going to be about like how bad COVID-19 is and pandemic. I'm not going to talk about that because we already know about it. And the research I've done about is that different people tend to have a lot of negative perceptions when it comes to the pandemic and COVID-19. And so I'm not going to continue that trend of talking about the negativity of pandemic and the impact. All right, so thank you for those of you who responded. Now I want to make sure I define my terms. If you Google the word pandemic literacy or visual analysis, you're not going to find much on Google. So it's not a term that has been defined. And I'm using this term in a very idiosyncratic way, but I'm going to define my terms. So when I speak of pandemic visual literacy, I'm not talking about those those gloomy images you see on TV and there's just reports about people dying and statistics. No, I'm specifically talking about writing reflectively, speculatively, argumentatively about visual images related to specific socio-political events that coincided with the COVID-19 pandemic. So yes, we have COVID-19, but we've also had other things coinciding with the pandemic. Even right now, I teach in a face-to-face class, we have to wear masks, and there's a lot more that is going on. And so the question is, what events, what images, what context, who is the audience, what set of writing instructions? But I'm going to focus on the literature, which I got from the Journal of Visual, this is from the Journal of Visual Literacy. And this is what the editors had to say about college students and visual literacy. I'm not going to read everything, but I'm going to focus on key texts that I've highlighted. They do not know how to interpret or evaluate images and how to use them for effective communication. I'm going to go to the next one. Educators who often take students' competence in image production and critical evaluation for granted. I should read from, the fact poses significant challenges to educators who often take students' competence in image production and critical evaluation for granted. In a world saturated by images, we are still more skillful in dealing with words rather than with visual imagery. This raises a bunch of questions. Question I have for this is, it depends on the set of students. I know that for some group of students, and I will share my perspective and my observation in class, it's a huge challenge. And I've seen some trends that I have to somewhat agree with the authors here, but I disagree with them in part. And these are some of my thoughts when I think of the pandemic visuals. I see a lot of slogans. I see images that are headline inducing. This particular one, too, from George Steinmetz, was from the Hart Island in New York. This made the headlines in New York Times headlines. And when, it was shocking. Judge Steinmetz took the picture and the New York police confiscated his drone. Because just the image of mass bearers on an island, that's something we don't see often. And so images, I see expression of outrage, discontent, political, social discontent. Definitely there are some socio-political demands and issues. We've heard about those who are calling for student debt to be canceled. And some are even saying cancel rent, as you can see in the visual image number 6. And we've seen this image of the Wuhan foot shake. This was trending. So images are something like some of them have been trending and they've spawned mimicry. Some visual images are very provocative. It depends on your political slant and triggers. Also, they're almost always multimodal. You can see the one from San Antonio. Some of them are very graphic. On the left, you see the image. This is coffins covered in special protective clothing or material. And I want to mention the fact that this is related to what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. Visuals contain missing premises. Forgive or rant. Okay, yeah. Is that an argument or a slogan? It's a slogan. And then we have stay home, save lives. What does that mean? That's a slogan, but it's an argument. I'm going to argue with missing premises. And then I think this pandemic visuals or images that coincide in with socio-political events can be teaching gold mines. For instance, I know that many of us in different places we work, we've been asked to turn in a vaccination record or talk about a vaccination status. So this is a topic for argumentative writing. Is this ethical? Is this about public safety? Or is this about freedom of expression? You don't have to, so this could be a topic in a writing class. So I think that definitely we can talk about these visuals and these are teaching opportunities. One professor who got me thinking about this, his name is Michael Sandel, and he's a popular Harvard professor of philosophy. He had this pandemic ethics, this is on YouTube, and he's just talking about the ethics of vaccine passport and what have you regarding the pandemic and what and how we should respond to it. So that's an interesting discussion, and I think it's a topic that can be debated in an argumentative writing course. He definitely got me thinking about this. And the second activity that I have, the first activity I have, second activity I have for you guys is this. Now, when it comes to this particular image, you can see, what are some interpretive perspectives a student might provide upon seeing this image? You can feel free to use the chat box to interact. What are some contextual details a student might be missing in developing an argument, for instance? So any 8 of these questions, you can respond to them, use the chat box, and I'll tell you what I think from my experience and from using this visual in my class, just as an analysis activity. Let's take about 30 seconds. Wow. That's a good response. Someone said, in my experience, students often gravitate towards describing rather than interpreting. So I think the initial discussion might revolve around what they see. That's a good perspective. That's a good point. Yeah, I have to agree with that, and I will explain my reasons. Good point. Anybody else? Any observations? Or like perspectives? I'm just gonna go in and continue. So when I've used this image in class, oh, let's see, we got another response. Okay, yeah, China is responsible for the pandemic. That's a good point. I like the fact that you brought up that, but I'm gonna tell you from using this in the class what some students have said. So for some, what I see, I'm going to go back to the first response that I got, is that students tend to lean towards describing rather than interpreting, and that's something I notice a lot. I noticed students don't even, the fact that we have Wuhan there, and I caption the image with Wuhan shake, they don't even know anything about, they don't see anything about this is the place where COVID-19 originated. I don't expect them to even know that this is an informal grading style that is used in China before the pandemic, unless they've done some thorough research into this. Some of them might not even know that Wuhan is a city in China, as I've mentioned. So I see a lot of describing of what they can see, the 2 guys who are just grading. Yeah, so that's absolutely correct. But I don't see a lot of discussion about China for my students. They don't see anything about China. China is just like completely out of the picture. And I was wondering, like, even though I provide them a clue that you have Wuhan, but they don't see anything about that. So that's interesting. We'll continue to our discussion. And there's another reason why I've taken this. Around the time I was planning to teach, this was early this year, we had this event, and we were still in the height of the pandemic when it happened. Then last year too, we had the George Floyd murder. So 2 events. It's interesting that because the 4Cs released a statement, and I thought I should include this here because as instructors, we want to foster rhetorical awareness. And visuals are powerful in communicating all sorts of messages. So another thing about visuals is that, especially, and this includes pandemic visuals, and to quote from Simon Bell, in art and design, multimodal writing does not liberate words to be more loose-limbed, but in fact does the opposite, creating layers that might be heightened and or segregated modes of meaning or modes of expression, or any combination of either. That's quite loaded. But in thinking about visuals, I also think about opportunities. When students can think and reflect about a visual image, even if they're not given a broad, specific heuristic or criteria for analysis, they still have the freedom to analyze, to use their imagination. to build on visual cues, to make arguments from them. And what I've noticed is that even when they do this, especially when they're not given heuristics, I usually see lots of speculations that make me wonder, so where did you get this from? I don't see any evidence for this, but it's because of the power of visuals and imagination that it leads them into different destinations. And so I think of example of J.R. Tolkien's The One Ring. J.R. Tolkien was very much interested in myths and languages. He even created his own language. So we see some of this with The One Ring. It's that, yeah, this is fantasy, but it's inspired by reality. It's inspired by some truth. And I thought about this image from Wakanda. This is inspired by reality as well. This is not real, but speculative writing does talk about things that are in other realities, but still have their base, some relationship with reality. And I thought of this quote: "The more complete the art, the more capable the short story is of arousing speculation." So when I see students responding and saying things that I don't see there, I'm like, this is because the image could be triggering other ideas that they had, or maybe other experiences that they've had that it reminds them of. Just think of this image. I once had a student, and she, I gave students a series of images, and this happened when we had a George Floyd, around the time we had a George Floyd when protests. How many narratives can be generated from this single image? Any thoughts? We probably have all sorts of narratives. I see lots of slogans once again, placards and inscriptions protesting against injustice. I had one student say that this was about how police officers are immoral. That's such a generalized conclusion, a hasty generalization. And I asked the student, say, where did you see that? Maybe you can temper this argument and say, maybe this is telling us something about injustice committed by some police, but not by all police. But so students have all kinds of speculations when they see visuals. I don't know where they're coming from. It could be because of their bias. And we'll talk about bias later, because that impacts students when they respond to images. So I want to talk about slogans, because these are also a feature in many of the pandemic visuals I've seen. And not just pandemic visuals, but also in a lot of visual images. So this was a bumper, so we have, I took a picture of this on a car. So we have kindness, everything. Yeah, we may agree with, we can agree with that, but that's not an argument. It's just like missing premises. But we also have slogans like "Keep Hope Alive," something that J.C. Jackson Senior had used in his 1988 speech. Now that was persuasive, but he backed it up with a long speech, and he displayed his oratory skills in that speech. We know that slogans are political, but yeah, still that's missing. Make America Great. What sort of arguments do we have for that? Well, that's open to interpretation. So I want to talk about academic arguments because in discussing this, my focus is to move from slogans to arguments. This is a very simple definition that I got from the book Practical Arguments. An academic argument is a type of formal argument that takes a stand, presents evidence, includes documentation, uses logic to convince an audience to accept or at least consider the writer's position. Now, arguments, usually very complicated, can be messy, very divisive, and not settled, but I like engaging students in arguments. I want them to have this civil conversation about what they see and the visual images that they are assigned. And I'm going to discuss one method. I think it's important to talk about multimodality because these images that we talk about are an interaction between various texts. So we have this from Alan Archer and Esther Brewer. Multimodality is referred to as a field of application. In higher education, it's seen as manifested in multimodal pedagogies. in multimodal student checks, in interdisciplinarity. I also recognize too that multimodality is not just limited to just one field. We have it in composition, we talk about it, arts and design is talked about. And I'm going to go over how different students from different backgrounds have responded to visual images, especially in my class. Perhaps we've mentioned this before, but I want to talk about this briefly. This is last activity before we go into Q&A. Reflecting on significant events during the 2020 to 2021 pandemic year. Can you mention some, using the chart function, of course, some significant events in the world that have occurred during the 2020 to 2021 period? Try to use the chart to do this. Take a few seconds, maybe like 30 seconds. COVID, yeah, that is an interesting one. January 6. But there's more than that. I should have said we had a Black Lives Matter protests. Yeah. Okay, there's a lot more. There's a lot more. I was expecting that we would say, well, if we don't, okay. Yeah. A lot of people agree it's like we focus more. Yeah, that's good. Contentious presidential election, an attack on the US Capitol. Okay. So COVID is a good one, but we all know that life is moving on, even though COVID and Delta variant is still there, and things are happening. Because of time, I'm just gonna go to, okay, let's see, we got another response. Forest fires in US West. Okay, that's a great one. So the West is burning, and where else are we drowning in the South? Okay, so somebody was talking, that's interesting perspective. Yes, so I agree with that. I'm going to move on to, okay, we got another one. Economic challenges. Yes, that's a good point. Hurricanes in the South, and so that causes flooding and what have you. So we got a lot going on. And so it's not just a pandemic and all those negative reports. So this is what I came up with. And this is not, I can't put all the events, but this was the ones I was thinking about in my class. Like many of you mentioned, COVID. We had panic shopping last year. We had nations going into lockdown. We had the George Floyd protest and his murder. We had the summer of anger and global protest about George Floyd. This was last year. We had Facebook mandates and pushbacks, and this has been happening this year. But we've also had Americans going to the polls last year's election. We have the results of the elections being contested. We've also had mass vaccination. There's a debate about student debt, insurrection at the Capitol, student loan extension. We've also had events that we saw making the news in Afghanistan, the fall of Kabul. We've had vaccine mandates and some colleges returning back to face-to-face. There's a lot more than that. And as some of you have mentioned, we have forest fires. So these are the set of images that I've used in my class. There's probably more than this, but I can't put all of them all in this presentation slides. And any of this can spark a conversation, an argument, or a debate. But I try to narrow them to this. This all happened during the 2020 to 2021 academic year. And I use this, to get students to debate, to analyze. It's an activity, and we have, okay, sure. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a field experiment that was done on critical thinking and getting students to slow down, and also why I think that having students, this should be scaffolded. So one way, so this came from John List. I got this from John List, and he's an economist. So he did a field experiment, and it's a field experimentalist. And so one way in order to get students to slow down when you ask them questions, so like activities, is to, according to him, you have to introduce data, introduce caveats that they do not even know of. So for instance, when students say, if you ask the question, is there a value in putting yourself in somebody else's shoes? And the answer is, in many economic situations, there is a great value. The next thing for the instructor to do will be like to introduce data or experiments on trust. And after introducing the data, there's going to be a caveat to that. Many features can influence how people behave and experience, and the experiment focuses on a few of those reasons for cooperation. So it's not a perfect response, because I think in visual, and we'll talk about this, but I want to talk about how he thinks of critical thinking. So according to John List, there's a hierarchy when it comes to critical thinking. So you have those on top that he calls great thinkers, and though you have the model thinkers. Now, the model thinkers, according to him, you have 80% of students are here. This is the area where you have preconception, prejudice, status quo bias, and argument by example. I think this is interesting because when I see this, when I give students, when I ask them to analyze visuals, I see a lot of bias. Like, I don't even know where it came from. Some of them will try to interpret, they start injecting their biases, and it has little to do with the image that they're analyzing. It's just their own political slant and bias that comes in. So according to John List, so at this stage, we have model thinkers, we have 80% of students are here. And then neophyte, that's what it says. Students are struggling with correlation and causation. And then adept thinkers seek to improve their own theory of minds. Students don't arrive at the area where he calls grades, where you expect intellectual computation, where you receptive to feedback, where students are their own worst critic. But it's an interesting perspective. And I relate this, and I try to take one of his experiments and try to do that when I introduce my visual analysis activities. So I start with I have it's a phase one activity. So in the phase one, I have them speculating or brainstorming or reflecting about the image. And then in phase two, I actually give them like a criteria. This is how I want you to analyze it. And then I also, in the phase one part, I will criticize something they say or point or just raise a question about, why did you say this here? And I'm going to talk about how I do that. So this is prompts that I've given students in analyzing and responding to visuals. So I would tell them to just pick one and use a slogan to analyze. Now, why did I ask them to use a slogan? Because I see a lot of slogans in pandemic related visuals. So I want them to be thinking about visuals. And then after completing this first activity, the first phase, and usually they throw out a lot of their perception, their biases, not surprisingly. I go to the second phase, which is like I ask them to revisit their post, the image, and I ask them to think about it in terms of purpose, composition, and arguments. Now, what I see students do, a lot of them will talk about, a lot of them do not want to let go of their previous analysis, so they just hold on to it. On few occasions do I see them, but I see a lot of them will try to make changes here and there. And usually they will talk about arguments, and they will argue according to what they believe the perception is bordering. Sometimes a lot of them miss out on composition. Pictures are not perfect. Pictures leave out information. They only capture one scene, not like every scene. And a lot of them just miss out on that. But not all students. These are my other conclusions for my class. Some students believe that it will not require much mental agility to analyze a photo. Hence, they just throw out their own bias and just say, so they think it's just going to be easy. And of course, like somebody had mentioned, they go on to just describing. They don't even pay attention to the text, like the particular slogan and what possible meaning or even contradiction that could result in. For instance, cancel rent. It's not the government, the moratoriums on evictions, it's just to make sure that the tenants pay later, but not to forgive the rent or cancel the rent. I also noticed that students tend to engage in hypothetical thinking when they see visuals. You can't blame them, especially if you don't give them the second criteria. If you don't give them any criteria, they can only resort to hypotheticals and speculations. Now, the set of students that I see who do very well in analyzing visuals are the ones from with a background in arts and graphic design. They tend to present strong visual analysis, commenting on technical aspects. And I have a student sample that I had to get a permission for this. And I asked her, said, she told me that she used to work with a student newspaper when she was in high school. And she's very much interested in Photoshop, Adobe, and arts, in the visual arts. So when she came up with this response, I wasn't surprised. She commented on the rule of thirds, and that was quite spot on. But she missed the point about forgive or rent, because I was like, because since I'm a writing instructor and I was talking about slogans, that forgive or rent, actually, if you think about it as an argument, it's missing a premise. So how can we make that into an argument? I can talk about that later. But this student was very strong on analysis, and she handled this pretty well. But still, she forgot to talk about the other side. This is just projecting one perspective about the debate on housing and rent. What about the tenants? What's going to happen if we forgive all rent? What about those who are just dependent on the money they earn from rent, who are retired? That's another perspective that is left out. When it comes to multimodality, there's a way, this is what the Bachelor 2016 said, arguments can foreground difference, produce ambiguity, and so open the space for reconsideration, for a shift in values and attitude, and for an extension of thoughts and investigation. And students don't often want to change their, I know that if you give them a criteria, they would have to analyze according to that criteria. And that's when I noticed they're making changes in the way they're analyzing. But usually before I give them a criteria, I try to point out like how there's weaknesses in this one. So for instance, this is a slogan by J.C. Jackson. This can be put into an argument format with premises. He's pretty much saying that Americans should keep hope alive. But the slogan by itself, it's not an argument. And then we also have situations where we can talk about culture, where we can talk about social and political events in talking about academic arguments. And this is one example. So this is how I decided to map out the arguments. So forgive or rent, and then we have stay home, state lines. Students can develop arguments in this. This is when I put a map of this argument, I put this more like where you have premise and you also have evidence that supports the premise. The same with the other one, forgive or rent. Students are not thinking in these terms. Students are just thinking about how they can just, what it reminds them of a narrative. But if you give them a criteria, then they'll be forced to analyze. Here's what Jumping says, and I'm going to focus on that. It's crucial that we, as teachers, educators, explore how best to embed critical thinking skills in our own classrooms. Yeah, so we're going to have a Q&A soon. So how best to embed, giving students the best chance to discover their own patterns of thinking and how they can become better and slower thinkers, both within and how beyond the walls of their classrooms. I've noticed that sometimes I've getting student comments on the first when I introduce them to when I get in the part one analysis and I point out what they couldn't see or what they failed to mention. Students are usually interested in saying more about it because they realize that what their comments did not capture or left out a particular conversation in the debate. So students who are reflective and who are open to feedback usually want to say more or do more if they're given a criteria, if something else is pointed about their analysis of the visual. And here's what Silver Karasatai said: by approaching images not merely as an aid or support, but rather as significant components of the experience of communicating in a foreign language. She's an ESL. Students slow down, look slowly, reflect, and take ownership of the image through writing, speaking, creating. These are all empowering practices that cultivate 21st century skills of viewing and visually representing, which our students are going to need as citizens, future employees. and lifelong learners. We reached the end of this, but I wanted to ask if there are questions, thoughts. Maybe you've done something like this in your class, or you have suggestions about how to do it in your class. I'm open. If you're in whatever department domain. Any questions?
You can go ahead and put them in, go ahead and put them in the chat. And while they're, people are typing, I just had one question. Once you've gone through this process with the students and kind of giving them some parameters or whatever, do you see on the other end that they start thinking differently? I mean, do they see the benefit of having a more critical look at arguing, or do they still hold on to those reactions?
That's a great question. From my experience, I had one student who I know very critical minded, strong in analysis, but she saw the image of the protesters and she was very negative towards the police. But I was trying to make her point. I was trying to point out that yeah, you can have this reaction, but you can temper this. You didn't need to like come up with a hasty generalization in your analysis that all police are immoral. But she was like, I still stand my ground. She refused to change her position. I had a student like that. But most students, yes, they are usually surprised when I say, hey, you forgot this. What about the renters? What about other people that this picture? These pictures are usually very limited. I had one image on cancer death, and all it did was showed politicians who are on the left who were talking about cancer death. It doesn't talk about other politicians who, for instance, maybe Republicans or independents who probably don't even agree, or even maybe other Democrats who don't even agree with canceling all student loans. So students don't even see oppositions at work. They don't even see that. They just focus on one perspective and say, oh, this is why student debt needs to be canceled.
We had a comment, I think, here from Jen Wilson. I've used the photo Starving Child and Vulture by Kevin Carter, not using a slogan, but image only. And I think this is still, Jen, students were to analyze the image, research the background, and summarize the wider issues and problems the photo / image indicated. So a similar kind of project, I think.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. Yeah, so I usually, it's not something that I usually don't ask them to do research, but some of them have done research. I once had like an ESL student because I guess she was curious about it, but I try to limit the visuals to specific events in the United States. I try not to think of, like just recent crises like the Taliban taking over Kabul. Because some students usually would just say things that would not be relevant to. I don't know why they. Oh, in this car, series of slogans. So I try not to give them all the information because I want them to also think about. I want them to freely express themselves. So I don't give them all the information that, hey, this is the research I find out about it. But if I think they're saying something that is contrary to reality, contrary to research, like students couldn't even identify the senators in the photo of cancer student death. They didn't even know who Chuck Schumer is. Like, I'm surprised that they didn't. So it was interesting. You just seeing different perspectives.
Right. And, so we are just about out of time. So Isaac, would you mind putting your email in the chat? And then if people have questions that they think of, which as we always do 10 minutes after the thing is over, maybe they can contact you.
Yeah, I'm doing that now. Yeah, that's my email.
Okay, there you go. So Isaac's email is in the chat if you guys want to capture that. And so thank you very much. Very informative. Love the images. We still have 2 more, I believe, sessions left for WOTE. So please come if you can. Thank you very much, Isaac. And so Jen's going to kick us all out for a minute, and then you'll have to go back and log back in if you want to come to the other, when you come to the other sessions. So thank you very much, Isaac. That was very informative.
Thank you all for joining. Bye-bye.